away. So it's very sort of prophetic that this was like, his whole life's work, basically. The Rebbe considered it to be his whole life's work. And they were like distributed on the passing of the Rebbe with a mimer that like was prepared to be going out to the Hasidim that day. So the Rebbe took it as sort of the guidelines for the whole new generation. And when the Rebbe became Rebbe, which was a year later on the same day, he said a mimer to become Rebbe, which was an explanation of that mimer from the previous Rebbe. And then every year on that same day, he would give a further explanation. For 40 years he did that. So the whole, we said last time, the whole basically leadership of the Rebbe was essentially based on this mimer. It's very, very significant. So we're coming up on the Yortzeit of the previous Rebbe and the day that the Rebbe became Rebbe in a month from today. So we're going in there. So it starts off with this understanding that there is the Basi Lagani Achosikala is that Shlomo Melech is saying, I've come to my garden, my sister, my bride. And the idea is that he's coming back to earth to dwell in the Beis HaMikdash after he left due to the sins of 7 generations of sinners, starting with Adam, going until basically Avraham. Up until not including Avraham, there were 7 generations of sinners which pushed the Shekhinah out of the world. And then Avraham arose and brought 7 tzaddikim after him until Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was the 7th, and all 7ths are beloved, and he brought the Shekhinah back to the earth. And this was accomplished by Matan Torah, but primarily building the Mishkan. So HaShem had like a house in the world again. So, okay. I think we left off right at the end of page 4. Everyone has the copy of the mimer that needs. Mm-hmm. You want a copy of the mimer? We have some more of these. Where were they all put? Should be amongst these here. Okay. So the last thing we said was the pasuk Tzadikim Yishu Aretz V'Yishkenu La'ad Aleha. Tzadikim inherit the land and dwell forever on it. And we gave a little Hasidic perush on that. Tzadikim inherit the land really means they inherit Gan Eden. And why? How do they do it? Because they draw down Yishkenu La'ad. They draw down the level of Ad, Shochen Ad, Marum V'Kadosh upon it. Basically, a level of divinity that they draw down through their actions allows them to, so to speak, inherit Gan Eden. So that should be found and revealed here below. And this is top of page 4. Zeu Basi Lagani Laganuni Lamakum Shayikaru B'Tachila. That's what it means that I've come to my garden. Don't read it as the word garden, but chuppah, because the word gani comes to the word ganuni, chuppah, the place that I was originally married to the world. The tzaddikim, so to speak, returned me to that place. The Ikar Shechina B'Tachtonim Haisa, because originally the Shechina was in the Tachtonim when Hashem created Adam HaRishon, and the tzaddikim have the power to draw it back down through their actions. Okay, Va'inyan hu Dinei Tachlis HaKavana Bebrias V'Yisavos HaOlamos. The purpose of the world, basically. Why did Hashem create the world? It's a good question. Dinizhava HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yos Lo Yizbarach Dir B'Tachtonim. So this is like the crying call of like the explanation of why for everything, because Hashem desired there should be he wanted a dwelling place in the lowest worlds. There's a few different reasons given in Chazal why Hashem created the world. Some from the Zohar, some from here, some from the Midrash. But the Midrash explains that it's because Hashem desired a dwelling place in the lowest worlds. This is the reason for the creation. He wanted to make a world so that in this lowest world he would have a place to dwell in it. That there should be an ability for there to be a revelation of God below, and specifically through the work of man. That's one of the things that says in the lowest worlds, because basically to create a world where it's not clear that he even exists there, it therefore requires a voda of the work of man to sort of find him and have free choice. And this was his great desire. He wanted to make a place where there's such a thing as free choice, where you think that you can do the opposite. And therefore it requires the work of man on our part to create this dwelling place for him. And how do we do it? Al yedei iskafia v'ishapcha. So there's these two terms, which are the two prongs of service to God. Iskafia v'ishapcha. What do they mean? Iskafia is subduing, and ishapcha is transformation. So basically, what's the difference between them? Subduing means you come across something that your animal soul wants to do, and you don't allow it to do it. Right? You subdue yourself, you subdue your passions, and in doing that very thing right there, you're basically using your free will to champion the cause of godliness over the apparent worldliness, and you deny basically your passions. Ishapcha is even then called transformation. You take the object and you use the object itself for a divine purpose, and therefore you're able to actually take the world and turn it into godliness itself, not just subdue it and turn away from the worldliness of it. So these are the two prongs of avoda. And this is basically the purpose of the world, was to accomplish these two tasks, either to have hiskafia or hishapcha. The neshama tered lamata, the soul comes down below, lislavish baguf and nefesh bahamis, in order to invest itself into a body and an animal soul. Vehem yalimu v'yastiru al or haneshama, and they, the animal soul, conceals and covers over the light of the godly soul. Ubekol ze, nonetheless, tifol haneshama birur v'zicho haguf hanefesh bahamis. Nonetheless, the soul is able to figure out a way to refine and purify the body and the animal soul. V'gam chelko v'olam. So this is basically the purpose of life, that you get put into a situation where you have this great opposition. You have a body which is there to conceal you and sort of pull you into opposite directions than your soul wants to go, and nonetheless you overcome it. It's the idea of like being victorious over this challenge, and you nonetheless refine the body. The body's trying to drag you down. Instead, you take the body and you do mitzvahs with it. You refine it. And not only do you refine it, but through it you refine parts of the world that are around you. And it was, you're part of the world, basically. It's everything you ever see, anything that ever comes into contact with you. Believe it or not, there's parts of the world that you don't see, they have nothing to do with. Someone else has that job. So everything that is within your sort of antennas of knowing that exists, it's there for you to uplift and to refine. And this is the purpose of not only your existence, but the entire creation of the world. So the reason why the world is here is that for a Jew to come in and refine himself and refine it.
What's this word, tipo? Tipo neshama?
Is able to affect, like a pa'ula.
Pa'ula. And also like helko, that's refine?
No, gam chelko ba'ola means his portion.
You're right, his
Chelik is his portion.
Right.
Ba'olam, in the world. So you're supposed to affect birur and zichok, as refine, on the goof and the nefesh habahamis, on the body and the animal soul, and also your portion of the world. V'zeu v'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'socha. And that's what it really means when it says, "You shall make for me a temple, and I'll dwell within them." In other words, b'soch kol echad ve'echad. Every single person is intended to, so to speak, make a temple. What's the temple? That HaShem, we said, came back down and brought a revelation of godliness into the world through Moshe Rabbeinu, who created this space for HaShem, was able to draw him down. And then we said, really, that's the work of the tzaddikim. The tzaddikim, it's not the temple that did it, it was Moshe that did it, it was the tzaddik that was able to basically unearth this level of divinity in the world, and it just expressed itself through this temple. And then it says, upon the commandment of making a temple, it doesn't say, make me a temple, I'll dwell within it. It says, make me a temple and I'll dwell within them. Which means that clearly we all have this task that through ourselves we can basically make a space for HaShem, a temple in this world. And what is the temple? It's taking a worldly object and allowing it to be transformed and become a godly object. And every single person has the power to draw down this revelation by making a temple for HaShem, making a space for HaShem in themselves and in the world around them. And how do you do it? This is what's the classic term, the avodas habirurim, the refinement process. And there's two ways of going about it. So this is it. Keep it simple. Iskafia and ishapcha. Subjugation and transformation. In other words, that's how you make a temple, right? You have to essentially, what does it mean to subjugate? Again, that you certainly can't make a temple out of something which is going against Hashem's will. So you have to first clear the space, so it's not filled with something negative. You know, if you're filled with foreign desires and the animal soul is acting out its plan, so there's no chance you can bring inside of that place any godliness. So the first thing you have to do is basically stop it from doing that, a subjugation, and then you can use it for Hashem. The Kamaimer. So where do we see this? So this is a mimer from the Zohar. Kad iskafi sitra achra, istalek yikar dekucha brichu b'kulu almi. So this is a line that's going to continue throughout the whole mimer. And again, it's a 20-chapter mimer. We're only going to read 6 chapters, because we said we're going to jump into the Rebbe's explanation of the 6th chapter. But nonetheless, this is the statement, which is going to take a long time to explain. He says, Kad iskafi sitra achra, istalek yikar dekucha brichu b'kulu almi. When you have hiskafia, you subdue the sitra achra, the other side. You istalik, you reveal yikara de kuchabrichu, the glory of Hashem, bekulhu almim, in all the worlds. So the question is, what does that mean? When you subdue the sitra achra, you reveal the glory of Hashem in all the worlds. How do we explain that? What does it mean, all the worlds? We're going to go into this statement of what it means, all the worlds. Anyone have a hunch? Just simple. What does it mean? If you subdue the sitra achra, the other side, you reveal the glory of Hashem in all the worlds. What happens? Hashem's glory gets filled in all the world. What does that look like? Each world gets a measure of revelation. That's what it sounds like, right? It sounds like that there's many, many worlds, and when you reveal the glory of Hashem, each world basically lights up with a certain glory, because of the action that you performed here.
It's like what you do below in this world affects the world above.
Right, and each world seemingly has its own consciousness and its own parameters, and every world's affected on its level according to what goes on down here.
And I guess if you bring light down here, it has to go through all the worlds.
It has to go through all the worlds, so it's maybe it happens like a domino effect.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like. All those things we just said.
Yeah.
But the whole point that Rabbi wants to bring, he wants to say that he looks at it differently, these words. What does it mean, all the worlds? And he says, V'hine masha kasuk b'kulhu almin. This that say, you reveal the glory of Hashem in all the worlds. Hakavana al madregas ha'or to b'kulhu almin b'shaveh. It really refers to, not like what we just said, but to a level of light which is equally found in all worlds. The Hainu, and what is that light? The Or Sovev, the Or of Sovev Kolomim. The light which is called Sovev, the surrounding light, Shemeir B'Kol Olmas B'Shaveh, which shines equally in all the worlds. So let's stop here for a second. So why is this different from what we wanted to say before? Because what we wanted to say before was there's many different worlds, and they're defined, each one by having a certain vessel, which is X amount of large, right? And the light which comes in, if you have a bigger vessel, we talked about this in the previous matter, if you have a bigger vessel, more light goes into that world. If you have a smaller vessel, less light goes into that world, depending on basically how much you can hold. That's how much godliness will be able to be contained in that world. But that level of divinity, which basically is tailor-made to go into vessels, that's already to begin with a limited level of godliness. Because the fact that it can be limited by the vessels, and it can show up more in one place and less in another place, shows that it's not the true infinite light. Because the true infinite light is not bound by vessels, and frankly cannot be held in any vessel, and limited to express itself in one small way or even one big way. It's just an infinite light. And so the idea when we say that when you have hiskafia, you reveal the glory of Hashem in all the worlds, it doesn't mean that each world necessarily lights up according to its parameters, but rather it refers to a light which is equal in all the worlds, which is a light which is beyond the world, all the worlds equally, which means that if the highest world, let's say, is 1 billion and the lowest world is 1, so the idea is that it's a light which 1 billion cannot get any closer to it than 1 can. Something which is truly infinite, right? So it equates the biggest number and the smallest number. Because essentially, 1 billion is not any more of it than 1 is. Because if it goes on forever, this is the way basically the numbers work, right? If you have 1 over a billion, you have 1 billionth of something. But if you have, a billion over infinity, you have how many parts of infinity have you taken away? 0. You follow that? So if you have 1 over infinity, or a billion over infinity, or a trillion over infinity, all of them basically are 0 parts of infinity. They don't take up any place in this thing because they're finite in some way, and the infinite is beyond them entirely. So what we're talking about now is a light is triggered to come into the world when you have iskafia, which means what? When you don't eat the donut. Something seemingly very simple. You're just like refining your body in the smallest way. How much worse if you're going to do a mitzvah or come and put on tefillin one day? He starts telling you basically what is the preciousness of avodas Hashem and the slightest details, that you reveal and unearth a light which is completely beyond all worlds. That even the world of Atzilus, which experiences divinity on like a divine level, in some way is a finite world because it has vessels and it's dealing with a limited measure of godliness. But when you do these actions in this world, you unleash something which is called the Sovev Kolomi, which is Atzilus can't grasp it any more than Asiya can grasp it, because it's just simply beyond the comprehension of any. It's beyond comprehension period. It's beyond grasp period. And nonetheless, when you do a simple action of iskafia, that world becomes revealed simultaneously in every place. And this is the purpose of creation. Hashem put us here to work on ourselves in this way. And when we do, the reward is that it unleashes Mamish Hashem in a way which is beyond all worlds. So we don't see it per se, but it basically happens. If we could see it, it would nullify us out of existence. But we basically harness it and bring it here, and not only bring it here, bring it everywhere, upon every action. So this is what he means. When you have a sky, and that's why I said this is the purpose of everything. Hashem created the world for the sake of this iskafia. Okay, so this is called the Or Sovev Kolomim, Shemeir B'Kol Olamos B'Shavet. It shines equally in all the worlds. The Olamos, when it comes to worlds, there are levels, there's differences. One world is higher than the other, one world is lower. You can't compare the higher worlds with the lower worlds. What's the difference? In the higher worlds, godliness shines in a revealed way. In other words, it's clear and apparent that God is in those worlds. Whereas in the Olamos Hatachtonim, you don't see so much light. And you get lower, even to lower worlds, the light comes in a way where it's not only revealing itself a little bit, but it actually conceals itself altogether and you see no light. So basically it just brings out 3 different levels of worlds. One, it's like full measure of godliness. One is that the godliness minimizes itself so it only shines a little bit. And one is the godliness basically is now hiding behind the vessels and all you can see is things and no godliness at all. It's as though the godliness is completely not there. So this is when it comes to worlds, you have different distinctions between, as we said before, how much godliness each world can handle. And there's differences. And as it says, Kamosha Kasuv, Af Yadi Yasda Aretz, V'yamini Tibcha Shemaim. As it says in the Pasuk, that my hand spread out the earth, and my right hand stretched out the heavens. So basically my hand refers to the left hand, it created the earth, and my right hand stretched out the heavens. Meaning to say that there's more revelation from the right hand, and this is therefore creating the heavens. The heavens is where godliness sort of put his right hand, his major work, and there's more godliness there. The left hand, he made the earth, it's his weaker hand, there's less godliness in the earth than there is in the heavens. The Isa b'Midrash, the Midrash says, Nata yaminu ubara shamayim, nata small ubara arat, same thing. He stretched out his right hand, he made the heavens. He stretched his left hand, he made the earth. Which means there's a distinction between how much power is in each world, in the heavens versus the earth. V'yedua diyad yamin more al ha'or v'agila yoser. It's known that the right hand represents more light, more revelation. And that's what it means that yamino tivcha shamayim, that his right hand stretched out the heavens. Shamayim, what does it mean shamayim? Hakavana olamos elyonim. Is that there are higher worlds, there's more light. Sham hagila b'chinas yamin, and therefore it's indicating that it's the right hand is revealed there, which is Giloy Yoser. V'or atzmo hu b'chinas Giloy. So in other words, not only is there basically more light in that world, but the light itself is shining, right? It's actually showing itself to be godly light. There's a notion that they say that in Atzilus, it's Elokus b'pshitus and Olamos b'hischadshus. Meaning to say that in the higher worlds, the obvious thing that's going on is godliness. And the worlds is some kind of like a chiddush, the fact that there can even be a world where there's creatures going around that are unaware of godliness and sort of their existence is felt by them. That's like a wild, wondrous thing that it's shocking that Hashem gets to the perspective of Atzilus. It's a shocking thing that you can have creations going around thinking they're independently existing. So this godliness is obvious, and creation is like a chiddush. Whereas in our world, the lower world is the exact opposite. The fact that there could be a place where it's godly, this is a chiddush. And what's simple and what's presented to us and obvious is that there's worlds, is that there's existence and separateness. Why is it? Because over there the light is greater, and the light is in a state of revelation. And here, as you go down the Seder Ishtalshus, the light diminishes and diminishes to the point that you don't see it at all anymore. Instead of seeing the light of God, the light of God is hiding inside of the entity that it's making, and the entity is walking around having the light of God busy enlivening him, and yet he's completely unaware of that and thinks that he is the entity that's there in that place, as opposed to godliness. So that's the idea, that the left hand makes the earth, it minimizes the godliness to this level. The Eretz, what is the Eretz? The Kavana El Olamos Tachtonim, this is going to the lower worlds. We talk about the earth, and that's the idea of the Bechinas Small, that's the left hand. She'ena Or Bagili Kolkach, that there's not so much light. Vegamor Atzmo Va Bechinas Helam Vehester. So not only is there not a lot of light, in other words, it's like the light is, there's just a more amount of light above. So when you finally come down to the lower worlds, there's less light available. Besides the fact that it's less available, it also becomes invisible. It hides inside of the creation. You don't see it anymore. So this is the pattern. As is known, the difference of the four general worlds. So in general, there's really infinite worlds, and there's infinite numbers of contraction of these states of revelation and concealment. But in general, we sort of divide the whole thing into four states, and we call them the four worlds. And this is what where is this found? It's indicated in the Pasuk. And it was, where do we get this idea of the four worlds? We learn it from the Torah, where it says, Kol hanikra b'shmich lichvodi, v'rasiv yitzarsiv af asisiv. So it says, everything that was created in my name and in my glory, he created it, he formed it, he even made it. So basically, if you look closely here, you see that there's going to be like four categories. What's called my name and my glory is one category. And basically that's Hashem's name, Hashem's glory. It's something which is still His. It's not yet an entity that He made. That's world number one. That refers to Atzilus. And then it says He created it, He formed it, He even made it. So these become the three lower worlds of Bri, Yitzir, and Asiyah. So you have the world of Atzilus, which is still a divine world, basically, which means what is a divine world? It's not yet an entity which is separate from God. It's just Hashem, how He contracts Himself into some type of a finite form, which is, again, not a physical form, but some kind of a spiritual form that Hashem contracts Himself into 10 spheros, but He's not creating an other. It's just Him in the presentation of a finite entity comprised of 10 spheres, but it's still Him. That's why it's called my name and my glory. And then from that stage and down, Hashem then says He creates it, He forms it, He even made it, which means that He then, from that finite state He put Himself in, He creates three different entities of worlds. How you doing, Dad? He creates three different entities of worlds, each one, yes, experiencing themselves as separate. And from the world of Bria already, there's this feeling of God versus creation, right? That He actually made an entity which is not Him in its own estimation. And that entity which is not Him in its own estimation continues going lower and lower, getting in a state where it's not really, what's the difference between creation and formation, right? Is that, for example, if you take let's say, metal out of a mountain, right? You mine metal out of a mountain, so you've taken out of its source, and before that time, the metal in the mountain was one thing. It was just a mountain, right? Whatever was inside of it, some type of would-be entity, it was meaningless because it was inside of its source. So that's, let's say, for example, Atzilus. Atzilus is when the concept of the world does not yet exist as a separate entity to Hashem, and it's just nullified inside of its own source. So this is what we were saying before, that in that world, godliness is obvious, and worldliness would be like some kind of a wondrous chiddush that you wouldn't even imagine that such a thing could exist, that you could have an entity that exists in its own estimation separate from God. So that's like the metal inside the mountain. It's not yet in a situation where it's been separated from its source. Then let's say you mine it out and you've got like all this metal, but it's at this point it's just a blob of unformed metal. So it still has some type of a recourse to saying that you can tell that it came from this source. Where does this come from? What's the source of this thing? You can see that it's just basically unformed metal mined from a mountain. But when you get to this, so that's a creation. It's already separate from its source, but it doesn't have any formation which gives it like a unique, identity other than having been made from its source. So the world of Bria, even though it's a world which is sort of in a constant state of recognizing its creator, because it's not yet been formed into its own consciousness and its own separateness, because we didn't hit the world of formation yet. So once you take the metal and you form it, let's say, into a spoon, so all of a sudden you look at the spoon, you look at the mountain, they basically have nothing in common with each other. It looks like it's just like has its own business here. It's got nothing to do anymore with its source. And then if you start taking this spoon and basically put it into the world, you start eating with it, and throwing the dishwasher and drying it. It's just like in the world of action. It's no longer just like a meditative instrument. Like, I wonder where this spoon was formed from and came from. It's just off and running, basically, totally disconnected in its own little world of action. So these are the three stages that you mine the metal from it, you form it, and then you use it, and it goes through successive levels of basically being in its own world, in its own, experience, which has nothing yet more to do with its source. So this is what the four worlds are getting to this point where it creates an entity which seems like it's off running on its own, has nothing to do with where it came from. Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. So these are called the world of emanation, creation, formation, and action. And basically, even though, as we said before, there's infinite numbers of subtle contractions getting from one state to another, we group them all essentially into these four parts. And that's what the word of Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, that's what it is basically. It's a little diagram indicating that godliness works in four parts. That there's a four-step process to any system, and primarily the system of creation, of bringing something into nothing, and it goes to these four levels, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and that's basically descending from one world to the next until you get to the bottom. So, as we said before, you can see this process like in the world that he made with this process. So in our world, we have these four levels of inanimate, growing, animal, and man. And it's the same thing. Those are like the four worlds inside of our world, right? Since everything is created ultimately in the big picture from this level of Yud Kei Vav Kei, then you can see this process in every single thing, that it has these four stages, including like the life force that we see on the earth. It also goes in these four-stage process. And inside of a human being, we have our own little Yud Kei Vav Kei. We have our intellect, and we have our emotions, and we have our thought, speech, and action. So you can chart all these things that basically the different systems that take place in any entity really is a four-step process of going from a state of sort of unified with the oneness until it expresses itself in full in its separateness.
Bria is separate. It starts to separate.
Bria already starts to separate.
That'd be the Vav.
That's already the hay, yeah.
Right.
Right. The first hay is already
Right.
a separation. Because what is the yud for a second? The yud actually represents a contraction, right? The yud is the smallest letter, so the shape of the letters also indicates what they do. So the yud, the smallest letter, represents contraction basically, and putting everything inside of a point, which means you've lost nothing, but you've basically sucked it all up inside of a point, like you've taken the infinite and you somehow, the infinite has decided to allow itself all to exist inside of one finite point, which is like the biggest wonder of all, right? And that Hashem can do that. He can take all of himself and decide he's not going to go anywhere. He's just going to like basically conceal it inside of one point. And inside that point, even though what you see and what's presented to you is now just one small point in place of what used to be the infinite, in reality, that point contains all the infinite light that was there. It's just sitting inside of a point. It's like fusing the infinite inside of something finite, making a finite container for something infinite.
Like compact?
Yeah. And that's the Yud. Meaning that's the world of Atzilus. That's what Atzilus is. Atzilus is basically taking all of Hashem, but since if you have all of Hashem infinitely expressed with no like recourse to having like to wanting to contain himself in any way and therefore express himself in any way, it's Hashem in an unexpressible form. So what Hashem does when he contracts himself and puts inside of a finite point, he didn't lose any of the godliness, but he basically gave it a sort of point of reference that from there is where you can access all the godliness. And that's like the world of Atzilus, which basically contains the entirety of God, but it puts it into a little 10-sphero system. It puts it into like a little body, a finite entity, which really contains everything inside of it, but at least it has sort of coordinates that you can now point to and say, there's God. So it's actually, even though it's a contraction on one hand, it's actually a revelation on the other hand, because you're contracting the infinite in order to allow there to be a finite presentation that it can actually show itself and reveal itself. So that's called the world of emanation. Hashem starts to emanate, meaning he starts to like shine and allow himself to be perceived, and that's the first world. So that's still him, right? Because it's just him in a finite place, as opposed to him creating a finite entity that's not him, and that's the world of Bria already. You following this?
Like the Hatzilus?
Atzilus, the highest world.
Is like literally Hashem containing himself in a vessel with like boundaries? Like
well, the idea, we call it a point in order to sort of, for a reason, a point doesn't really have boundaries. In other words, a point, a real mathematical point, you can't measure it. It's like a non-existing space, right? But that's the idea, is that he sort of puts himself into this place where it's no longer infinite. You can't necessarily define it so easily either. It's not like it's like clearly measurable. But ultimately what we do say is that this point represents the ability for Hashem to, yes, be finite. So in other words, a simple question to your answer is, yes, Hashem contains himself in something finite, the entirety of Hashem. And that's sort of...
And he exists within these 10 spheros, within this point.
Yeah, but in full. In other words, in a certain sense, what you see is the 10 spheros, but really what's contained inside of there is the same infinite God.
Is all of Hashem.
Is all of Hashem. But now it has an access point, because the idea was if it's all of Hashem, you can't grasp it in any way. Because it doesn't allow itself to sort of mold into any... What does it mean grasp? If you grasp something physically, it means it has to have what we call the 6 directions in order to get your hands around it, right? If it goes on forever in one particular direction, it's not graspable there. So you say the same thing about the mind. If you want to grasp an idea, we also call it, there's the 6 directions of an idea. Like if one part of the idea goes on forever, so to speak, you can never understand that idea. To grasp something, it has to be containable from all angles. And Hashem wanted himself to be able to be grasped, which means he had to make himself containable, because as he was in his like sort of apparent situation, he was if he was ungraspable. If he's ungraspable, he's unknowable, and he's not be able to have an experience with anybody else, right? Mm-hmm. So he wanted to basically make the lowest worlds, make a finite place, and then have himself be able to be revealed in that finite place. So essentially, he had to make this wondrous miracle of making the infinite God show up in a finite package. And that's really the unique concept of what Judaism is. Like in a certain sense, that's what the Torah is. That's what Yisrael is. That's what the Beis HaMikdash is. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu is. So we take all those 4 things, you'll see that they all represent that. The Torah is basically a finite book with X amount of letters, but the whole God is in there, right? You know, Jewish people, we're like a finite group of people, you know, but Hashem is one with his people. In other words, if you want to find God in this world, he's with the Jews. The Beis HaMikdash It's a place on the map in a certain country, in a certain city, a building with a room. And if you go in that room, you'll find that the whole God is in that room. The ark and basically the Holy of Holies, and you go into a finite place, and suddenly you're in the space of the pure infinite. Because this is like this wondrous thing that Hashem can do anything. So if he can really do anything, then just like he can be infinite, he could also be finite if he wants to. Not does it mean that he can be finite in the sense that he's no longer infinite. He could put that infinite state into a finite state as well. So that's why we're all amped up on doing mitzvahs and learning Torah and doing things in an exacting way. We're so like maniac about like halacha and like, no, you put your tefillin on like this and not like this, and you put this time, not that time, because all those finite rules and boundaries, they're actually the unique finite container that Hashem made to hold the infinite.
But yeah, so I apologize if I'm.
You're not. This is actually the first time I'm enjoying the class here. Sorry. So no coffee, no eating is good.
So how can all of Hashem be in the Torah, and then all of Hashem be in the Mishkan? Or is that what you said? The Mishkan?
Yeah.
So if it's all,
right,
by definition, it can't be in two things.
Right. How's the finite fit into the infinite fit into the finite?
So, and that finite be more than one finite. If you're saying it's four finite, okay. So if all of Hashem is here, well then none of Hashem could be here because all of it's here.
Isn't that exactly what we learn now in particle physics? That things actually can be more than one place at one time? I mean, that's exactly what the physicists are now discovering. That God has known, we've known from the Torah all along, God is whatever he chooses to be, wherever he chooses to be, whatever he chooses to be.
Right. No, let me also explain that. You're dealing if this is what I was trying to say about 1 in a billion a little while ago. If you're trying to say that there's a certain amount of it, right? So that if you take some of the amount and you put it here, then it's there now and it can't be there. But that's because you're dealing to begin with a finite entity, right? Which you can cipher off into one place or another place. This is an infinite entity, right? Which if you take a little bit, you've not removed any of it at all.
But it's not a little bit; it's all.
Right, but I'm saying in this finite place, you're saying if Hashem's here in this finite place,
all of Hashem. And maybe I'm being too literal. Like
I think so, because when you say all of Hashem, you're quantifying him as an entity which can have an all. You can actually get your hands around the whole thing.
I thought that's what you were saying. Is he takes all of his infinite,
and
he puts all of it in a point.
So this is a contradiction in like logic. All of infinite can't fit anywhere in a finite place ever. Like that's what I'm saying. It defies logic to say that you could put all of infinity in a finite point to begin with, right? Because it doesn't fit into any.
Right.
To put something in a box means the thing itself has to fit in the box, right? If infinity does not fit in the box by definition, you can't put it in a box. You can't put it in any box. It's like if you're going to try logically speaking, you can't fit it into this place. You can't fit into this place, and therefore, just as illogical as that is. If you're going to say that you can somehow put it in a box, then there's nothing precluding you to say that if I'm going to put it in a box, that each box can contain the whole thing.
Right.
In other words, it doesn't really make sense because if you look at it, because it's wondrous. You can't do anything like that with any entity that we know about. You know what I mean? It's God talking here, and this is the great wonder of God. This is what really uniquely separates Judaism from every other religion. Also, is that we basically are claiming that we have sort of the literal box that holds God, right? In other words, it's not just like a good, healthy way to get spiritual. These are not just practices that sort of like are good for your body or good for your soul or basically like allow you to sort of experience mystical experiences. Nothing like that. It says in the Gemara, if Hashem asked us to chop wood, we would chop wood. There's no real reason that like we seemingly know about why Hashem chose that if you put on your leather straps, that will contain the infinite being. But if you put on plastic straps, it won't. Right? Because it's something completely beyond comprehension. He said that I'm infinite and I'm choosing a finite dwelling place for myself. That just defies logic. What would you choose? Like what unique like box would you choose? Like what color would it be? What shape would it be? And because seemingly that it's irrelevant, right? But that's what's so wondrous about our mitzvahs, is that the fact is Hashem also chose something finite, which means it puts such an unbelievable emphasis on what the finite thing is, because it's that and not something else. And therefore it becomes completely godly that it's this color, this shape, and something, because God chose those details, not man. And if God chose those details, the infinite is found in, you'll find him in there, the full him.
So that he's finite in his point,
Right.
but still remains infinite in all of existence.
Even in that point.
Yes. He's basically, he did not actually contract himself to the point that he goes away. He just basically, he made it so that it's not showing everywhere. Right? Yeah, that's what we call it, the contraction. In other words, he put it like this, like when that point is now sitting there, and where did the rest of it go? As far as Hashem is concerned, it's still everywhere. It's just that now he created a space where he's not everywhere, so that there can be the concept of someone else can have an experience of that space. He basically created the yud is really like it makes the space in a certain sense. Because if you make a point, that means there's now this concept that there's something that could be other than being swallowed up and lost inside of the infinite light. So he creates the space for the other. So now there's a perspective of an entity besides him that can grasp him. Just because that perspective is happening in the mind of the entity doesn't mean it's happening in the mind of that infinite light, which was presently there a second ago. It didn't go anywhere. It's still there 100%. It's just not showing itself. Right? So then basically he creates this space, he creates the world, and inside the world you can now have certain entities which sort of like channel that infinite space and sort of draw it down. And every other action, which is not one of those specific actions, is just creating the space, and it's not creating a home and a mishkan which draws that light and brings it down. It's like certain points of light which allow that infinite light to burst through and experience itself into the creation, as it were.
So it's a
we would have
perceived
no way to
contraction.
experience God.
Right.
It's a perceived contraction.
Makes sense.
Right.
Simultaneously, one and different.
Yeah, we would have no way, being the entity that we are,
Right.
we would have no way to connect up unless we have this point to draw down that line, to draw down that light.
Right. If he didn't actually make himself finite, but he just sort of hid himself and made a finite world,
We'd be walking around aimlessly.
we'd be walking around aimlessly. We wouldn't have any way of actually, because as my brother was saying, logically, there is no way that a finite being can connect to an infinite being, right? Because there's no way for us to hold him, grasp him, know him. So if he would have just made the world, then his infinity would not have been on his own design, like brought into contractible finite forms. Then the finite world would just be in its world, and the infinite world would have been in its world, and they would not have been able to communicate or experience it. The idea of mitzvah means to join. So suddenly Hashem gave us this gift called the mitzvahs, which allowed, they didn't always exist on the world, you should know. They came at the time of Matan Torah. So there was a certain era of creation on this world where the entities on earth did not have recourse to really connect to the infinite God. Even Abraham and even Noah, none of them, because they didn't have mitzvahs yet. Hashem had in mind to put his infinite being inside of physical, finite entities that you could sort of jimmy up. But he didn't do it yet. Right?
The mere fact that there's an existence of a finite world,
Yeah.
and that we're in it, is already God's contraction, because there's no room for us to start.
Fine,
with.
it's God's contraction, but it's not putting the infinite in the finite place. It's like my brother was saying, you can always remove the infinite and then make a finite pool of light, and then it works like the way he was saying. You put some here, you put some there. Godliness can also be like a piece of godliness which distributes itself into finite worlds and finite vessels. But that doesn't mean that in any of those places the infinite light is found. The infinite light is hiding. And in place of the infinite light is some kind of a finite light which is responsible for the creation's existence.
But the creation of the world is through the process of tzimtzum.
Yeah.
Right? He contracted himself, but he was always here.
Yeah, but what was in the place of the worlds was just the contracted version of him. They did not have recourse to tap into the infinity which was in their place.
Yes.
God was there in that place in an infinite way, but in the place of the finite worlds, it was just the finite worlds. So until Hashem said, okay, I'm going to make myself, make myself exist in a finite place, right? The full totality of myself exists in a finite place. That was accomplished by mitzvahs. So that when you jimmy up a certain type of activity.
What was accomplished by mitzvahs was the ability to see the infinite, or to touch the infinite in the space of the finite. But the infinite was always contained. In other words, the finite could not exist without the infinite having created it.
Again, but it was creating it in a way where it was not found inside of it.
It wasn't perceived inside of it.
It was not only not perceived inside of it, but it wasn't able to get into, perceived. It wasn't able to go into the space of the finite, so to speak.
I'm trying to understand. It wasn't able to go into the space of the finite, or the finite was not able, that we, since we didn't have the keys to access the infinite within the finite,
Right.
all right, that we couldn't see it, or we couldn't touch it, but it was always there.
It was there in a way you couldn't see and touch, which had no effect on you. It had no ability to actually.
It's in a rock.
Okay, but it's in a rock. If the rock is not in the midst of performing a mitzvah, it's basically a concealment of God.
Yeah, it's a concealment, but it's always there. In other words, God didn't create the finite and leave.
He did. He did to a certain degree. That's exactly what he did. He didn't really leave, as we're saying. Like the infinite light is always sort of underlying everything, but in terms of the fact that the creation does not perceive him, and before Matan Torah didn't even have the way of bringing the infinite into the finite, it's exactly what there was. They call it like there was a decree, like Hashamayim Shamayim La Hashem Va'aretz Livnei Adam. The heavens were the heavens for God, and the earth was for man. And there was a decree that spirituality could not permeate physicality, and physicality could not experience spirituality. And that's how it was until Matan Torah. And Hashem, when He gave the Torah, He ended the decree. And He said, Hashem, V'yered Hashem al Har Sinai. Hashem came down onto the mountain. V'ala Moshe lahar. And Moshe went up on top of the mountain. And there was this like weird new existence where the physicality could actually experience and unearth inside of it the spirituality. And that's not something that we could have done on our own. It's something that He had to basically make these entities. The entities, you're right, they always existed in theory. They always existed, and when did they start existing? In the world of Atzilus. The world of Atzilus is that. The world of Atzilus is basically Hashem deciding to put Himself in a finite form. It's the first fusion of the infinite God in a finite place. But the world of Atzilus is not this world. And therefore, when He created the Bria, that the world of Atzilus, so to speak, was God in the form of a man. That's what we call it. Like God all of a sudden has wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. God has attributes, but who knows where that is? And and from that place that Hashem now has all these attributes, He's like, well, if I have a mind, I'm going to speak. And when He spoke, He created the worlds. And those worlds were a creation and a separate entity, so to speak, from that being, right, of God. Like when Hashem made Himself finite, what happened is only in Atzilus the infinite and the finite were joined. But from Atzilus and below, they only got the finite aspects of Hashem. The infinite were not shared with them. That's why Atzilus is such a wondrous and unique world. It's like the first mitzvah. Right. It was the first thing that joined infinite and finite, right? But from that place, you now have worlds above it, which are purely infinite and not finite, and your worlds below it, which are purely finite and not infinite. And those two worlds cannot be joined together yet. So the voda of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov until Moshe Rabbeinu, they were sitting in this finite world, which did not yet have recourse to access the infinite, and each one of them brought the Shekhinah further and further and further down until Moshe basically was able to put it in a box, literally. And that box is not just the box, it was all the mitzvahs that He gave us, that He was able to bring Atzilus down into this world. That's what He did. He brought the concept that God could be fully existing and revealed His full self in a finite form into the physical world. Because after the sin of man in the Garden of Eden, which also existed there temporarily, it was that level of godliness disappeared from this place, and it was lost to us. And it took these 7 generations from Avram to Moshe to basically bring it back down and allow the finite to contain the infinite again in the physical.
That's what we were saying the other day about the several levels coming down, then going back up, then going back down, then going back up again.
Right. You follow this?
Yeah, it's amazing. So, to summarize...
Yeah, we are at the summarizing point here.
What appears to be mutually exclusive, which is that you can have infinite and finite existing at the same time,
right,
is not, because it's
God
Hashem,
can do anything.
Right. And so what appears to be impossible, illogical, irrational,
right,
is like it totally works. So
Right.
Hashem can be infinite and finite at the same time.
Right.
It's like, we're talking about different worlds, but it's like different dimensions.
Right.
So two things that are mutually exclusive can exist in two different dimensions because they're different.
Well,
Let me
Exist
Let me just bring out one more point to sort of,
How's this?
yeah.
Not only two existences, they can in one existence, infinite and finite. It doesn't have to be two.
No, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
The point I wanted to make, just bring back to the Maimon for a second. Now we can understand what he means when he say Kadiskafia Sitra Achra Istalak Yikar Dekucha Bricha B'Kula Omi. When you'll have hiskafia, which means you'll do the simplest thing. Like, that's what we kind of bring down. Like, what you get from this is like mamish the significance of a mitzvah. Like when you put on your tefillin, you're like literally making the infinite God be in this finite place, and because God said it can be there. Same thing is true whenever you withhold your passions on something, because that's also a mitzvah, a big mitzvah. So not just allow your animal soul to just think what it wants or say what it wants, to hold yourself back from lashon hara, hold yourself back from an ayin hara, from a bad eye, from a bad thought. Just the smallest, minute work that you do on yourself is considered a mitzvah. So if it's a mitzvah, that means the infinite will be contained in that finite action. So what are we seeing from here? That when you do that, when you have hiskafia, when you hold yourself back, you reveal the glory of God in all the worlds. And I went through that little thing to explain what does it mean in all the worlds. You could think it means that each world gets a little bit of the domino effect, that when you do a good action, Hashem comes and visits Atzilus, and then he visits Bria, and each one of those worlds gets a little light turned on. It's not what he's saying. That when you do this simple action, you reveal that level of godliness which is equal in all the worlds. In other words, this level of infinity, which is found everywhere simultaneously, because it's as you said, it's that thing which is in the rock, and it's underlying everything, but usually can't be seen by anything, because it's beyond any particular regular finite vessel to perceive it. So therefore it's called equal in all the worlds, because no matter how high of a world you are, you've got nothing to do with this light. You can't experience it, because the definition of a world is some kind of a vessel which has antennas and can perceive things. If you're trying to perceive the infinite, you can't with finite antennas. But so therefore this light is what's called equal in all the worlds, because no matter how big or small your antennas are, you're not seeing it. It's the infinite light which is in a contradiction to the finite light. When you do this simple action, you reveal that light which is equal in all the worlds into that action that you made. That underlying light of infinity which cannot fit into any world, which is equally unseen in every world, no matter how big the container of the world is. Nonetheless, with your little mitzvah, you unleash that light into this place, because it unites specifically with these finite activities.
So fasting today will also unleash it.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. All right. Shkoyach. Glad we had this little talk. Yeah. Okay. Shkoyach.